The marble halls of the highest court in America had never witnessed anything like this. Justice Elena Kagan, the 64-year-old legal giant with decades of experience on the nation's highest bench, sat across from American actor Jonathan Roumie in what was supposed to be a routine legal symposium. But what happened next shattered every expectation in the room. When Kagan leaned forward and uttered 7 words that would change everything. "Mr. Roumie, you are absolutely brilliant." The entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. Legal scholars froze. Court reporters stopped typing. Even the security guards turned their heads in disbelief. But it wasn't just the compliment that left everyone speechless. It was what Jonathan Roumie did next that would send shockwaves through the legal establishment and create a viral moment that the public sphere is still talking about. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss moments like these that are reshaping American discourse. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know who these two people are and why their meeting was so significant. Justice Elena Kagan had spent her entire career as a quintessential Washington insider. Appointed to the nation's highest court in 2010, she'd written landmark decisions and incisive dissents that shaped American law for decades. At 64, she was considered one of the most respected legal minds in the country, a woman who'd seen presidents come and go, who'd debated constitutional law with the brightest minds of her generation. But Kagan had also become something else in recent years, a symbol of established legal thought. Critics whispered she was sometimes too comfortable with the status quo, too focused on the institutional mechanics rather than the lived realities of modern America. On the other side of the room sat Jonathan Roumie, the beloved American actor, best known for his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen. While not a lawyer or politician, Roumie had been quietly turning heads with his passionate advocacy for various causes, his deep research into historical and social issues for his roles, and his remarkable ability to connect complex themes to the human experience. His work demanded meticulous preparation, a profound understanding of text, and an ability to convey the essence of an argument not just through words, but through conviction. But he was also something that made the establishment nervous, unafraid to delve into uncomfortable truths, unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom, unafraid to speak from a place of deeply informed, heartfelt conviction in ways that made career academics and politicians uncomfortable. The legal symposium was supposed to be a routine event, distinguished speakers discussing constitutional law with law students and young attorneys. But when the organizers decided to pair Kagan with Roumie for a panel on the Constitution in a Changing World, narrative law and public understanding, they had no idea they were creating a powder keg. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In an America divided along every possible line, here were two brilliant minds from different professional worlds, different backgrounds, different worldviews about to go head-to-head on the most fundamental questions facing our democracy. The audience of law students, professors, and legal practitioners had come expecting a scholarly discussion. What they were about to witness was something far more dramatic, a masterclass in deeply informed public advocacy that would expose just how much the legal establishment had underestimated one actor's unique insights. The tension began building from the moment they took the stage. Justice Kagan, in her trademark judicial robes, carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who'd spent years on the nation's highest bench. She nodded politely to Roumie as they settled into their chairs. But there was something in her demeanor that suggested she viewed this as a routine appearance, a chance to share her wisdom with a younger colleague, albeit one from a different field. Jonathan Roumie, dressed in a thoughtful, understated suit that suggested seriousness of purpose, surveyed the room with the keen eyes of someone who deeply understands human motivation and the power of narrative. He prepared for this moment far more thoroughly than anyone realized, not just as an actor researching a role, but as a citizen deeply invested in the issues. The moderator started with softball questions about constitutional interpretation, and initially everything proceeded as expected. Kagan spoke in measured tones about judicial philosophy, citing cases from memory with the ease of someone who'd helped decide them. The audience nodded respectfully, taking notes on every word from the distinguished justice. For nearly 20 minutes, the discussion followed the predictable pattern of such events. Law students asked deferential questions about landmark cases. Professors posed theoretical inquiries about judicial methodology. Kagan responded with the practiced eloquence of someone who had given thousands of similar presentations over her decades-long career. But Roumie remained notably quiet during this opening phase. occasionally jotting notes, but mostly observing. Those who knew his work recognized this behavior. He was studying the nuances of the conversation, waiting for the right moment to engage, much like an actor internalizes a script before delivering a pivotal performance. He understood the value of letting others establish their positions before revealing his own strategy. The turning point came when a third-year law student asked about the balance between judicial restraint and protecting individual rights. Kagan launched into her familiar response about the challenges of constitutional interpretation in a democracy, emphasizing the importance of deferring to elected officials while protecting fundamental rights. It was during this response that something shifted. The moderator, perhaps sensing the need to inject more energy into what had become a fairly standard academic discussion, decided to ask about voting rights, a topic that had become increasingly contentious in recent years. Kagan gave her standard response about the need for careful constitutional analysis and the complexity of balancing federal and state authority. But as she spoke, those watching carefully noticed Roumie lean forward slightly in his chair, his pen stopping mid-sentence as he focused intently on her words. The shift in his body language was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the intense focus of a performer ready to deliver. That's when Roumie leaned forward slightly, and those who knew his commitment recognized the sign. He was about to engage. "Justice Kagan," he said, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of a seasoned performer, used to captivating an audience with profound themes. "With all due respect, I think we need to be honest about what's really happening here." The room's energy changed instantly. This wasn't the deferential tone everyone expected from an actor addressing a Supreme Court justice. This was the voice of someone ready to engage deeply as an equally committed citizen. When we talk about balancing federal and state authority and voting rights, we're using language that sounds neutral and scholarly. But the reality is that this so-called balance has been used to justify systematic disenfranchisement of millions of Americans, particularly Black and brown voters. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not how these events usually went. Kagan's eyebrows raised slightly. She was used to deference, used to being the wisest person in the room, but something in Roumie's tone and the precision of his language caught her attention. "Mr. Roumie, she replied, her voice still measured, but with a new edge of engagement. "Surely you understand that constitutional interpretation requires us to rise above political considerations and focus on legal principles." The audience held its breath. They sensed this was becoming something more than a routine panel discussion. Roumie didn't back down. If anything, he leaned in further. "Justice Kagan, my work, particularly on projects exploring historical injustices and legal struggles, has led me to deeply engage with these issues for years. I've seen firsthand how rising above politics often means ignoring the real-world impact of legal decisions on real people's lives. When we make constitutional interpretation an abstract, intellectual exercise divorced from its consequences, we're not being principled, we're being privileged." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Legal scholars exchanged glances. Students stopped taking notes and started recording on their phones. This was unprecedented. A public figure from the arts directly challenging a Supreme Court justice's fundamental approach to law. But Roumie wasn't finished. He pulled out a slim binder he'd brought with him, something that had seemed like mere notes for a project, but now appeared far more significant. "Allow me to frame this with a specific narrative," he continued, opening the binder with the practiced motion of someone presenting carefully structured research. "In a recent case where the court addressed the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, your approach, Justice Kagan, focused on the evolving nature of federalism. But, Justice Kagan, that approach, however well-intentioned, has been interpreted in ways that allow for the suppression of hundreds of thousands of voters whose rights would have been protected by stronger federal oversight. So my question is this: when we prioritize abstract concepts like evolving federalism over concrete protections for voting rights, whose interests are we really serving, and how do we justify that to the communities whose voices are being silenced?" Justice Kagan sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioning system. Everyone waited to see how one of the most powerful jurists in America would respond to being directly challenged by an actor. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Jonathan Roumie himself. Instead of the defensive response many expected, Kagan's expression began to change. The slight frown of someone being criticized gradually transformed into something else entirely, the look of someone genuinely impressed. Impressed, Mr. Roumie, she said slowly, her voice carrying a new tone of respect. That is an exceptionally well-crafted argument. The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the audience, but Kagan wasn't finished. Your point about the relationship between legal abstraction and real-world consequences, I have to say that's exactly the kind of thinking the legal profession needs more of. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. Justice Kagan leaned forward in her chair, a shift in posture that was completely unexpected in the formal setting. The audience watched in fascination as the justice visibly worked through the implications of what Roumie had just presented. You know, she said, turning to face him directly, I've been thinking about these issues for decades, but the way you framed this challenge, it's forcing me to reconsider some fundamental assumptions. The room was electric with tension. Students were now openly recording, sensing they were witnessing legal history in the making. But then Kagan did something that shocked everyone present, including the seasoned legal professionals who thought they'd seen everything. She walked over to where Roumie was sitting, extended her hand, and said the words that would echo through legal circles for years. Mr. Roumie, you are absolutely brilliant. I mean that sincerely. The impact was immediate and visible. Mouths dropped open throughout the audience. The moderator looked stunned. Even the security personnel seemed taken aback by this unprecedented display of respect from a Supreme Court justice to an actor. But what happened next was even more remarkable than Kagan's admission. Jonathan Roumie, who had spent his career using his platform to illuminate complex human truths, who had often felt the dismissal of those who view artists as less serious than politicians or jurists, simply sat there for a moment in complete stillness. The silence stretched on. Everyone in the room could see the emotion playing across his face, not just surprise at Kagan's words, but something deeper. Years of preparation, years of proving the depth of his commitment, years of fighting for recognition of the substance behind his art and advocacy had led to this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried an unmistakable weight. Justice Kagan, he said, rising to shake her hand. I appreciate that more than you know, but I didn't come here today looking for validation. I came here because these issues are too important for any of us to approach them from a position of comfort or assumption. He paused, looking out at the audience of future lawyers and current legal professionals. What I hope this conversation demonstrates is that we all, regardless of our experience or position, have an obligation to keep questioning, keep challenging, keep pushing each other to be better. And that includes questioning Supreme Court justices when necessary. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, but Roumie raised his hand to quiet them. He wasn't finished. Justice Kagan, your willingness to engage with these challenges, to admit when an argument makes you reconsider your position, that's what intellectual honesty looks like. That's what we should demand from all our leaders, including ourselves. But then he did something that would become the defining moment of the entire exchange. He opened his binder again and pulled out a document that he handed to Justice Kagan. This is a detailed legal analysis I've compiled as part of my research for a project on the history of voting rights in America and a potential framework for a public awareness campaign. Not for any official opinion, of course, but because I think the legal arguments might interest you. The boldness of the move was breathtaking. An actor was essentially asking a Supreme Court justice to review his legal work as a serious peer, not as a supplicant seeking approval. But what made the moment even more remarkable was what happened next. Justice Kagan didn't just accept the document. She began flipping through it right there on stage, her eyebrows raising as she scanned the arguments. Mr. Roumie, she said, still reading, this citation pattern, you're building on the precedent from the 1965 cases, but connecting them to modern sociological data and narrative analysis. This is remarkably sophisticated legal reasoning for someone outside the profession. The audience watched in fascination as a Supreme Court justice provided real-time feedback on an actor's deeply researched work. Several law students were frantically taking notes, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The way you've structured the equal protection argument here, Kagan continued, pointing to a specific page, this could actually strengthen the constitutional foundation for future federal voting rights legislation, or at least provide a compelling public narrative for it. Justice Kagan looked down at the document, then back at Roumie, and something remarkable happened. She smiled, not the polite, professional smile of a public official, but the genuine smile of someone who had just encountered something unexpected and delightful. Mr. Roumie, she said, I would be honored to read this, and I suspect I'll learn something from it. The audience was now completely captivated. Phone cameras captured every moment as these two brilliant minds stood facing each other with obvious mutual respect. But Roumie had one more surprise in store. Justice Kagan, there's something else I'd like to propose. You mentioned that the legal profession needs more of this kind of thinking. What if we made this conversation the beginning of something bigger? He turned to address the audience directly. What if we challenged every law school in America to host similar dialogue? Not just between jurists and artists, but between legal scholars and community advocates, between policymakers and those whose stories inform the law, between anyone willing to engage with these questions honestly? The energy in the room was now palpable. Students were nodding enthusiastically. Professors were exchanging excited glances. Several audience members were already pulling out their phones, not to record for social media clout, but to take notes on what was clearly becoming a historic moment in legal discourse. We could call it the Honest Dialogue Project, Roumie proclaimed, a commitment to having the hard conversations about law and justice in America, even when they make us uncomfortable. A law professor in the third row raised her hand and called out, "Mr. Roumie, how would this differ from the typical academic conferences we already have?" Roumie turned to address her directly. "Professor, the difference is accountability and real-world impact. Academic conferences often become echo chambers where like-minded people reinforce each other's views. What I'm proposing is structured dialogue between people who disagree, but disagree substantively, with preparation and evidence, not just talking points and political theater." He paused, looking around the room at the engaged faces. Think about what just happened here. Justice Kagan and I come from different backgrounds, different generations, sometimes different perspectives on legal interpretation. But because we both came prepared with substantive arguments and approached each other with respect, we were able to have a meaningful exchange that advanced the conversation rather than just scoring political points. A student in the back called out, "But Mr. Roumie, how do you ensure these dialogues don't just become platforms for people to grandstand?" The question drew appreciative murmurs from the audience. It was exactly the kind of practical concern that would determine whether such an initiative could succeed. Roumie smiled, clearly pleased by the thoughtful question. That's exactly the right question to ask. The answer is structure and accountability. Participants would have to submit their arguments in advance, include citations and evidence, and commit to engaging with counter-arguments rather than just restating their positions. He gestured toward Justice Kagan. "Notice how our exchange worked. I didn't just say voting rights are important. I cited specific cases, pointed to concrete consequences, and presented evidence. Justice Kagan didn't just dismiss my concerns. She engaged with the substance of what I was saying. That's the model." Justice Kagan nodded approvingly. "Mr. Roumie is absolutely right. The structure matters enormously. In judicial conferences, we have protocols that force us to engage with the strongest version of opposing arguments, not just the weakest ones. That's what elevates the discussion." Justice Kagan's eyes lit up with interest. That's actually a fascinating idea, Mr. Roumie. The kind of cross-pollination of ideas that could really advance legal thinking. What happened next would be replayed on social media millions of times. Justice Kagan turned to the audience and said, "I want everyone here to understand what just happened. Mr. Roumie didn't just present a legal argument. He presented a vision for how we can do better, how we can push each other to think more deeply, more honestly, more courageously about the law and its impact." She paused, looking directly at Roumie. "This is exactly the kind of leadership the public sphere needs. And frankly, it's the kind of leadership America needs." The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything that had ever been witnessed in that formal setting. But the real impact of the moment was just beginning. Within minutes of the event ending, something unprecedented began happening across social media platforms. Videos of Justice Kagan calling Jonathan Roumie absolutely brilliant started spreading like wildfire. But they were accompanied by something even more powerful, the full context of their exchange. The initial clip that went viral was just 30 seconds long, Justice Kagan's admission followed by Roumie's composed response. But what made this different from typical political viral moments was that people weren't just sharing the clip. They were sharing longer segments that included the substantive arguments and the unique narrative framework that led to that moment. A legal journalist who had been in the audience live tweeted the entire exchange, creating a thread that was retweeted over 50,000 times within the first hour. "This wasn't just a moment of recognition," she wrote. This was a masterclass in how legal discourse should work, informed by deeply human perspectives. Thread 127. But the real indicator of the moment's significance came from an unexpected source. Law students across the country began organizing viewing parties to watch the full video together. At universities from coast to coast, students gathered in common room, lecture halls, and coffee shops to dissect not just what was said, but how it was said. A first-year law student at a prominent university posted, "Watch the Roumie-Kagan exchange with my study group tonight. We spent 3 hours afterward discussing constitutional interpretation. That's 3 more hours than we've ever spent voluntarily discussing constitutional law." This is what inspired legal education looks like. The ripple effects extended beyond just sharing clips. Legal blogs that typically attracted modest readership saw traffic spikes as people searched for deeper analysis of the constitutional questions Roumie had raised. Academic legal databases reported unusual increases in searches for voting rights cases and federal-state jurisdictional precedents. Legal Twitter, usually a fairly insular community, exploded with commentary. But this wasn't the usual partisan bickering that dominates political social media. Instead, law professors, practicing attorneys, and legal scholars from across the political spectrum were sharing clips and expressing genuine amazement at the level of discourse they just witnessed. Prominent constitutional law professor at a major university tweeted, "I've been teaching constitutional law for 20 years, and I've never seen a more compelling real-time demonstration of how legal dialogue should work." Roumie's preparation and argumentation were masterful, proving that profound insight can come from unexpected places. Another legal scholar added, "Justice Kagan's willingness to engage genuinely with challenging questions and her recognition of Roumie's brilliance shows why intellectual humility is so important in legal thinking, even for our highest jurists." But the impact went far beyond legal circles. The video clips were being shared by people who had never heard of constitutional law symposiums, but were captivated by watching two brilliant minds engage respectfully with difficult questions. The hashtag honest dialogue, inspired by Roumie's proposed project, began trending within hours. Law schools across the country started announcing their intention to host similar events. The dean of one prestigious law school issued a statement saying, "Mr. Roumie has challenged us to do better, and we're accepting that challenge." However, not everyone was pleased with what had transpired. Some conservative commentators attempted to frame the exchange as inappropriate, arguing that an actor shouldn't challenge a Supreme Court justice so directly. But these criticisms were quickly overwhelmed by a surprising source. Other conservative legal scholars who praised both Roumie's argumentation and Kagan's intellectual honesty. A well-known conservative law professor wrote, "Regardless of one's political views, what we witnessed today was exactly how legal discourse should work." Roumie came prepared with substantive arguments, presented them respectfully but firmly, and Kagan responded with the intellectual honesty we should expect from all jurists. This is what productive disagreement looks like. The praise wasn't limited to academics. Practicing attorneys began sharing stories of how the exchange had inspired them to approach their own legal arguments differently. A civil rights attorney in Atlanta posted, "Watching Jonathan Roumie yesterday reminded me why I went to law school. His ability to challenge power while maintaining respect and dignity, drawing on deep research and human empathy. That's advocacy at its highest level." But perhaps the most significant immediate impact was on law students and young attorneys. The comment sections of the viral videos were filled with aspiring lawyers expressing how the exchange had changed their understanding of what legal advocacy could look like. One second-year law student wrote, "I've been struggling with whether I want to continue in law school because so much of what we study seems disconnected from real justice. Watching Jonathan Roumie yesterday reminded me that law can be a tool for real change when wielded by someone with his courage, empathy, and preparation." The formal legal establishment also took notice. The American Bar Association announced plans to incorporate the honest dialogue concept into their continuing legal education programs. Multiple bar associations issued statements praising both participants for demonstrating the highest ideals of legal discourse. Within 48 hours, Jonathan Roumie's team reported receiving invitations to speak at over 30 law schools and universities. His staff was inundated with requests from legal organizations, civil rights groups, and educational institutions wanting to host similar dialogues. Justice Kagan, through unofficial channels, let it be known that she had indeed read Roumie's voting rights analysis and found it exceptionally well-reasoned. While she couldn't comment officially on specific public awareness campaigns, sources close to the justice indicated that the analysis had genuinely influenced her thinking on related issues. The broader public implications were equally significant. Cultural and political commentators took notice of how Roumie had elevated both himself and important issues through intellectual engagement rather than superficial performativity. Behind closed doors, senior strategists began discussing how to better utilize voices like Roumie's to bridge divides and inform public discourse. Diverse groups, while disagreeing with some of Roumie's specific positions, privately expressed respect for how he had conducted himself. One veteran political strategist was overheard saying, "I may not always agree with his conclusions, but damn, he knows his stuff, and he argues it with a conviction that cuts through the noise." The media coverage was extensive, but what was remarkable was how much of it focused on the substance of the arguments rather than just the celebrity aspect. Major newspapers ran analysis pieces examining the constitutional questions Roumie had raised and exploring the implications of his proposed honest dialogue project. One prominent legal journalist wrote, "What Jonathan Roumie accomplished yesterday wasn't just impressive advocacy, it was a masterclass in how to elevate important issues through substantive engagement. He didn't just captivate an audience, he advanced legal discourse by bringing a vital, outside perspective." The long-term implications began to crystallize quickly. Law schools started announcing curriculum changes to incorporate more real-world dialogue between different perspectives. The legal profession began discussing how to create more opportunities for the kind of cross-pollination of ideas that Roumie had advocated. Most significantly, the exchange had demonstrated something that many had begun to doubt was possible: that substantive, respectful dialogue between people with different viewpoints could still happen at the highest levels of American public life. A retired Supreme Court justice speaking at a legal conference a week later said, "What Mr. Roumie and Justice Kagan showed us is that intellectual rigor and mutual respect aren't incompatible with passionate advocacy for one's beliefs. Their exchange should serve as a model for all of us in the legal profession, and indeed for all citizens." But perhaps the most important impact was on Jonathan Roumie himself. The recognition from Justice Kagan, one of the most respected legal minds in America, validated years of preparation and hard work, affirming that his unique approach to understanding and communicating complex truths held profound value. More than that, it positioned him as a leading voice for a new generation of public intellectuals and advocates, capable of translating intricate legal concepts into compelling human narratives. Speaking to a group of law students a week after the viral exchange, Roumie reflected on what had happened. That moment with Justice Kagan wasn't about getting her approval or validation. It was about demonstrating that we can engage with the most important questions facing our democracy in ways that are both passionate and principled, both challenging and respectful. He continued, "Too often in public life, we're told we have to choose between being effective and being substantive, between fighting for our values and engaging respectfully with those who disagree." What I hope that exchange demonstrated is that this is a false choice. The most effective advocacy often comes from being the most prepared, the most thoughtful, and the most willing to engage honestly with difficult questions, no matter your profession. The Honest Dialogue project that Roumie had proposed during the exchange began to take concrete form. Within a month, a nonprofit organization was established to facilitate similar discussions across the country. Major law schools committed to participating, and prominent legal figures from across the political spectrum agreed to take part. Justice Kagan, while unable to participate officially due to ethical constraints, privately expressed support for the initiative. Sources indicated that she had been energized by her exchange with Roumie and was looking for ways to engage more meaningfully with different perspectives on constitutional questions. Her subsequent opinions and questioning during oral arguments reflected a deeper engagement with the real-world implications of legal decisions. The success of the project's early events demonstrated the hunger that existed in the legal profession and beyond for more substantive engagement with difficult questions. Rather than the shallow political theater that dominated much of public discourse, people responded enthusiastically to watching intelligent, well-prepared individuals engage respectfully with complex issues. For Jonathan Roumie, the moment had transformed him from a respected actor into a nationally recognized voice for deeply informed public discourse and principled advocacy. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Legal organizations sought his input on major cases and public awareness campaigns. Political commentators began describing him as a rising star, a public intellectual with the potential to shape American legal and political discourse for decades to come through his unique blend of artistry and advocacy. But the transformation went deeper than just professional recognition. Behind the scenes, something remarkable was happening in policy and legal circles. Prominent policymakers, legal scholars, and even some sitting judges began approaching Roumie differently. They recognized that his deep research and unique perspective weren't just impressive, they were useful. A senior policy advisor known for his own legal background privately sought Roumie's input on constitutional questions related to a new public education initiative. "I may disagree with some of your views," he told Roumie, "but I can't argue with your legal reasoning and your ability to make these issues resonate. If we're going to build broad consensus, we need people who understand the Constitution and its human impact as well as you do." This shift became most apparent during one of the inaugural Honest Dialogue Project events, just 2 weeks after his exchange with Justice Kagan. Roumie was moderating a panel on originalism and modern society and directly challenged a prominent legal scholar. "Professor," Roumie began, opening the familiar binder he had carried to the symposium with Justice Kagan, "in your recent writings, you state that you believe in faithful adherence to constitutional text and original meaning. I'm curious about how you would apply that methodology to a specific case often debated. In your 2019 article on the evolution of voting rights, you wrote that federal oversight of state election procedures should be extremely limited to preserve state sovereignty. But your reasoning relied heavily on interpretations from an era that predated the 15th Amendment's enforcement provisions and the Voting Rights Act. How do you reconcile strict originalism with the clear evolution of constitutional understanding around federal authority to protect voting rights, especially when considering the original intent of the Reconstruction Amendments?" The room fell silent. Other panelists looked up from their notes. The scholar shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for such a detailed, historically grounded challenge from an actor. "Mr. Roumie," he stammered, "that article involves specific historical context that—" "I'm not finished, Professor," Roumie interrupted politely but firmly, "because here's what troubles me about your reasoning. You cited the original meaning of the Constitution's text, but you ignored the original meaning of the Reconstruction Amendments, which were specifically designed to expand federal authority to protect voting rights for formerly enslaved people. Isn't that selective originalism? And doesn't it inadvertently undermine the very spirit of ensuring all voices are heard?" The question exposed a fundamental inconsistency in the scholar's methodology, one that many other legal experts had perhaps overlooked or chosen not to press. Within hours, legal experts were calling it the most substantive exchange of the project's inaugural dialogue. But those who knew him best said he remained focused on the work rather than the recognition. His team reported that he was spending even more time researching for his roles, for his advocacy work, and for the Honest Dialogue Project, inspired by the positive response to substantive engagement. "He's always been brilliant," said a longtime colleague. "What changed is that now everyone else knows it too. But more importantly, he's shown that there's still room in American public life for people who do their homework and engage seriously with important issues, regardless of their background." The viral moment had also changed Justice Kagan. Colleagues noted that she seemed even more energized, more willing to engage with challenging questions and different perspectives in her judicial work. Her subsequent opinions and questioning during oral arguments reflected a deeper engagement with the real-world implications of legal decisions, often drawing unexpected connections to sociological data or public sentiment. The exchange between Jonathan Roumie and Justice Elena Kagan became a case study in law schools across the country, not just for its legal content, but for its demonstration of how productive dialogue could work in polarized times. Students analyzed not just what was said, but how it was said, how preparation and respect could combine to create meaningful engagement, even across seemingly disparate fields. One constitutional law professor made the exchange required viewing in her course, telling students, "This is what deeply informed public advocacy looks like at its best." Notice how Mr. Roumie prepared substantive arguments, presented them respectfully but firmly, and how Justice Kagan responded with intellectual honesty rather than defensiveness. This is the standard we should all aspire to. The lasting impact extended beyond individual careers or even the legal profession. In a time when many Americans had lost faith in the possibility of productive dialogue across political differences, the exchange offered hope that substantive, respectful engagement was still possible. Political scientists began studying the exchange as an example of how democratic discourse could function effectively. The combination of preparation, respect, intellectual honesty, and willingness to engage with difficult questions provided a template for how public figures could discuss contentious issues without resorting to personal attacks or shallow talking points. For American democracy more broadly, the moment represented something crucial. Proof that excellence in preparation and argumentation could still be recognized and rewarded, even across professional and generational divides, in an era often dominated by performative politics and viral moments of conflict. Here was a viral moment of substance that elevated important issues and demonstrated the highest ideals of public discourse. The story of that day in the courtroom, when Justice Kagan admitted Jonathan Roumie was brilliant and he responded by challenging the entire legal profession to do better, became more than just a memorable exchange between two impressive individuals. It became a symbol of what American public and legal discourse could aspire to be: substantive, respectful, challenging, and ultimately focused on the great questions of justice and democracy that affect all Americans. As one observer noted in the aftermath, in a single exchange, Jonathan Roumie reminded us that public discourse and law at their best are about engaging with the hardest questions our society faces, not avoiding them. And Justice Kagan showed us that true wisdom includes the humility to recognize brilliance wherever it appears. Together, they gave us a glimpse of the kind of leadership America needs. The lesson for all Americans, whether lawyers, actors, students, or engaged citizens, was clear: preparation, respect, intellectual honesty, and the courage to engage with difficult questions aren't just professional virtues, they're democratic virtues. And when they're combined with the kind of brilliance that Jonathan Roumie demonstrated that day, they have the power to change minds, elevate discourse, and remind us all of what's possible when we bring our best selves to the most important conversations of our time. Thanks for watching this incredible story unfold. If you